This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Robert Browning by G.K. Chesterton. Section 17, Chapter 6, Browning as a Literary Artist, Part 1. Mr. William Sharp, in his Life of Browning, quotes the remarks of another critic to the following effect: "The poet's processes of thought are scientific in their precision and analysis. The sudden conclusion that he imposes upon them is transcendental and inept." This is very fair, but a very curious example of the way in which Browning is treated. For what is the state of affairs? A man publishes a series of poems, vigorous, perplexing, and unique. The critics read them, and they decide that he has failed as a poet, but that he is a remarkable philosopher and logician. They then proceed to examine his philosophy, and show with great triumph that it is unphilosophical, and to examine his logic, and show with great triumph that it is not logical, but transcendental and inept. In other words, Browning is first denounced for being a logician and not a poet, and then denounced for insisting on being a poet when they have decided that he is to be a logician. It is just as if a man were to say first that a garden was so neglected that it was only fit for a boy's playground, and then complain of the unsuitability in a boy's playground of the rockeries and flower beds. As we find after this manner that Browning does not act satisfactorily as that which we have decided he shall be, a logician, it might possibly be worth while to make another attempt to see whether he may not, after all, be more valid than we thought as to what he himself professed to be, a poet. And if we study this seriously and sympathetically, we shall soon come to a conclusion. It is a gross and complete slander upon Browning to say that his processes of thought are scientific in their precision and analysis. They are nothing of the sort. If they were, Browning could not be a good poet. The critic speaks of the conclusions of a poem as transcendental and inept. But the conclusions of a poem, if they are not transcendental, must be inept. Do people who call one of Browning's poems scientific in its analysis realize the meaning of what they say? One is tempted to think that they know a scientific analysis when they see it as little as they know a good poem. The one supreme difference between the scientific method and the artistic method is, roughly speaking, simply this: that a scientific statement means the same thing wherever and whenever it is uttered, and that an artistic statement means something entirely different according to the relation in which it stands to its surroundings. The remark, let us say, that the whale is a mammal, or the remark that 16 ounces go to a pound, is equally true, and means exactly the same thing whether we state it at the beginning of a conversation or at the end, whether we print it in a dictionary or chalk it up on a wall. But if we take some phrase commonly used in the art of literature, such a sentence, for the sake of example, as "the dawn was breaking," the matter is quite different. If the sentence came at the beginning of a short story, it might be a mere descriptive prelude. If it were the last sentence in a short story, it might be poignant with some peculiar irony or triumph. Can anyone read Browning's great monologues and not feel they are built up like a good short story, entirely on this principle of the value of language arising from its arrangement? Take such an example as Caliban upon Setebos, a wonderful poem designed to describe the way in which a primitive nature may at once be afraid of its gods and yet familiar with them. Caliban, in describing his deity, starts with a more or less natural and obvious parallel between the deity and himself, carries out the comparison with a consistency and an almost revolting simplicity, and ends in a kind of blasphemous extravaganza of anthropomorphism, basing his conduct not merely on the greatness and wisdom, but also on the manifest weaknesses and stupidities of the Creator of all things. Then suddenly a thunderstorm breaks over Caliban's island, and the profane speculator falls flat upon his face. Lo, lieth flat and loves Setebos, make his teeth meet through his upper lip. We'll let those quails fly, we'll not eat this month one little mess of whelks, so he may 'scape. Surely it would be very difficult to persuade oneself that this thunderstorm would have meant exactly the same thing if it had occurred at the beginning of Caliban upon Setebos. It does not mean the same thing, but something very different, and the deduction from this is the curious fact that Browning is an artist, and that consequently his processes of thought are not scientific in their precision and analysis. No criticism of Browning's poems can be vital. None in the face of the poems themselves can even be intelligible which is not based upon the fact that he was successfully or otherwise a conscious and deliberate artist. He may have failed as an artist, though I do not think so. That is quite a different matter. But it is quite one thing to say that a man, through vanity or ignorance, has built an ugly cathedral, and quite another to say that he built it in a fit of absence of mind, and did not know whether he was building a lighthouse or a first-class hotel. Browning knew perfectly well what he was doing, and if the reader does not like his art, at least the author did. The general sentiment expressed in the statement that he did not care about form is simply the most ridiculous criticism that could be conceived. It would be far nearer the truth to say that he cared more for form than any other English poet who ever lived. He was always weaving and modelling and inventing new forms. Among all his 200 to 300 poems, it would scarcely be an exaggeration to say that there are half as many different metres as there are different poems. The great English poets, who are supposed to have cared more for form than Browning did, cared less, at least in this sense, that they were content to use old forms, so long as they were certain that they had new ideas. Browning, on the other hand, no sooner had a new idea than he tried to make a new form to express it. Wordsworth and Shelley were really original poets. Their attitude of thought and feeling marked without doubt certain great changes in literature and philosophy. Nevertheless, the ode on the intimations of immortality is a perfectly normal and traditional ode, and Prometheus Unbound is a perfectly genuine and traditional Greek lyrical drama. But if we study Browning honestly, nothing will strike us more than that he really created a large number of quite novel and quite admirable artistic forms. It is too often forgotten what and how excellent these were. The Ring and the Book, for example, is an illuminating departure in literary method, the method of telling the same story several times and trusting to the variety of human character to turn it into several different and equally interesting stories. Pippa Passes, to take another example, is a new and most fruitful form, a series of detached dramas connected only by the presence of one fugitive and isolated figure. The invention of these things is not merely like a writing of a good poem, it is something like the invention of the sonnet or the Gothic arch. The poet who makes them does not merely create himself, he creates other poets. It is so, in a degree long past enumeration, with regard to Browning's smaller poems. Such pious and horrible lyric as The Heretic's Tragedy, for instance, is absolutely original, with its weird and almost blood-curdling echo verses, mocking echoes indeed. And dipped of his wings in Paris Square, they bring him now to lie burned alive. And wanteth there the grace of lute or clavithern, ye shall say to confirm him who singeth, we bring John now to be burned alive. 100 instances might, of course, be given. Milton's sonnet on his blindness or Keats' ode on a Grecian urn are both thoroughly original, but still we can point to other such sonnets and other such odes. But can one mention any poem of exactly the same structural and literary type as Fears and Scruples, as Householder, as House or Shop, as Nationality in Drinks, as Sybrandus Schaffenbergensis, as My Star, as A Portrait, as any of Ferishta's Fancies, as any of the Bad Dreams? The thing which ought to be said about Browning by those who do not enjoy him is simply that they do not like his form, that they have studied the form and think it is a bad form. If more people said things of this sort, the world of criticism would gain almost unspeakably in clarity and common honesty. Browning put himself before the world as a good poet. Let those who think he failed call him a bad poet, and there will be an end of the matter. There are many styles in art which perfectly competent aesthetic judges cannot endure. For instance, it would be perfectly legitimate for a strict lover of Gothic to say that one of the monstrous rococo altarpieces in the Belgian churches, with bulbous clouds and oaken sun rays 7 feet long, was in his opinion ugly. But surely it would be perfectly ridiculous for any one to say that it had no form. A man's actual feeling about it might be better expressed by saying that it had too much. To say that Browning was merely a thinker because you think Caliban upon Setebos ugly is precisely as absurd as it would be to call the author of the old Belgian altarpiece a man devoted only to the abstractions of religion. The truth about Browning is not that he was indifferent to technical beauty, but that he invented a particular kind of technical beauty to which any one else is free to be as indifferent as he chooses. There is in this matter an extraordinary tendency to vague and unmeaning criticism. The usual way of criticising an author, particularly an author who has added something to the literary forms of the world, is to complain that his work does not contain something which is obviously the specialty of somebody else. The correct thing to say about Maeterlinck is that some play of his, in which, let us say, a princess dies in a deserted tower by the sea, has a certain beauty, but that we look in vain in it for that robust geniality, that really boisterous will to live which may be found in Martin Chuzzlewit. The right thing to say about Cyrano de Bergerac is that it may have a certain kind of wit and spirit, but that it really throws no light on the duty of middle-aged married couples in Norway. It cannot be too much insisted upon that at least three-quarters of the blame and criticism commonly directed against artists and authors falls under this general objection, and it is essentially valueless. Authors, both great and small, are, like everything else in existence, upon the whole greatly underrated. They are blamed for not doing not only what they have failed to do to reach their own ideal, but what they have never tried to do, reach every other writer's ideal. If we can show that Browning had a definite ideal of beauty and loyally pursued it, it is not necessary to prove that he could have written In Memoriam if he had tried. Browning has suffered far more injustice from his admirers than from his opponents, for his admirers have, for the most part, got hold of the matter, so to speak, by the wrong end. They believed that what is ordinarily called the grotesque style of Browning was a kind of necessity boldly adopted by a great genius in order to express novel and profound ideas. But this is an entire mistake. What is called ugliness was to Browning not in the least a necessary evil, but a quite unnecessary luxury, which he enjoyed for its own sake. For reasons that we shall see presently in discussing the philosophical use of the grotesque, it did so happen that Browning's grotesque style was very suitable for the expression of his peculiar moral and metaphysical view. But the whole mass of poems will be misunderstood if we do not realize, first of all, that he had a love of the grotesque, of the nature of art for art's sake. Here, for example, is a short distinct poem merely descriptive of one of those elfish German jugs in which it is to be presumed Tokay had been served to him. This is the whole poem, and a very good poem too. Up jumped Tokay on our table, like a pygmy castle warder, dwarfish to see, but stout and able, arms and accoutrements all in order. And fierce he looked north, then wheeling south, blew with his bugle a challenge to drouth, cocked his flap hat with the toss-spot feather, twisted his thumb in his red moustache, jingled his huge brass spurs together, tightened his waist with its Buddha sash, and then, with an impudence naught could abash, shrugged his hump shoulder to tell the beholder, for 20 such knaves he would laugh but the bolder, and so with his sword hilt gallantly jutting, and dexter hand on his haunch abutting, went the little man, Sir Ožebush, strutting. I suppose there are Browning students in existence who would think that this poem contained something pregnant about the temperance question, or was a marvellously subtle analysis of the romantic movement in Germany. But surely to most of us it is sufficiently apparent that Browning was simply fashioning a ridiculous knick-knack, exactly as if he were actually moulding one of these preposterous German jugs. Now, before studying the real character of this Browning-esque style, there is one general truth to be recognised about Browning's work. It is this, that it is absolutely necessary to remember that Browning had, like every other poet, his simple and indisputable failures, and that it is one thing to speak of the badness of his artistic failures, and quite another thing to speak of the badness of his artistic aim. Browning's style may be a good style, and yet exhibit many examples of a thoroughly bad use of it. On this point there is indeed a singularly unfair system of judgment used by the public towards the poets. It is very little realised that the vast majority of great poets have written an enormous amount of very bad poetry. The unfortunate Wordsworth is generally supposed to be almost alone in this, but any one who thinks so can scarcely have read a certain number of the minor poems of Byron and Shelley and Tennyson. The end of section 17.